and now in Europe as well. What brings us together on this extraordinary occasion is the tragedy which has befallen not just the people of Japan, but also those who are friends of Japan around the world. And that has been the brutal assassination of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. We have brought together this event today with many who have worked with former Prime Minister Abe in Japan, those of us who have engaged with him in various capacities over the years. And we hope to use this hour which lies ahead of us to reflect not just on Shinzo Abe the man, Shinzo Abe the Prime Minister, but also Shinzo Abe's legacy for Japan, for the region and the world. As we begin, however, on this solemn occasion, I might ask each and every one of us simply to be silent and to reflect as we honor the memory of this extraordinary Japanese leader. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining those of us at the Asia Society in those moments of silent reflection on the contributions of a great man. Today, we are joined by a number of panelists from around the world. My name is Kevin Rudd. I'm the President and Global CEO of the Asia Society, and today I'm joining you from Sydney in Australia, where I am momentarily before returning to the United States, where I normally work next week. We're also joined, however, by a number of other speakers, and I would like to briefly acknowledge their status and their role and their capacity in which they join us. We're joined by Yoriko Kawaguchi, who served as the Minister for the Environment in Japan and subsequently as Foreign Minister of Japan. She continues as Special Advisor to the Japanese Prime Minister for Foreign Affairs between 2004 and 2005. She's a former member of the upper house of the Japanese Diet for the Liberal Democratic Party, of course, that being Prime Minister Abe's party. She's currently a visiting professor at Musashino University, a fellow at Musashino Institute for Global Affairs, and an honorary researcher at the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research. So we thank Yoriko for joining us today. We're also joined by Danny Russel, Vice President for International Policy and International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Danny was a former US Foreign Service officer, culminating in his role as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs under President Obama. He's also served as President Obama's Senior Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. Danny is a fluent Japanese speaker and was also US Consul General in Osaka, Kobe. Wendy Cutler will also be joining us. Wendy, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of our office in Washington, DC. Spent nearly 3 decades in the USTR, the Office of the US Trade Representative, where she also served as acting Deputy US Trade Representative. And during her extensive career on trade policy and trade negotiations, she worked on a range of regional, bilateral, and multilateral trade negotiations and initiatives involving Japan, and most, of course, acutely, most recently, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And finally, we're joined from our Tokyo Center as well by Takako Hikotani, recently joined the Policy Institute as a fellow attached to the Asia Society Center in Tokyo, professor at Gakushūin University International Center, an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University, where she obtained her PhD. She's previously taught at Japan's National Defense Academy, the Ground and Air Defense Staff Colleges, and the National Institute for Defense Studies, an expert on civil and military relations, Japanese domestic politics, and foreign policy. And one of her most recent books is entitled Trump's Gift to Japan, Time for Tokyo to Invest in the Liberal Order. So let's bring our panelists together for this opening set of remarks. to our gathering around the world today. Let me begin by making just a few observations myself as a former Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister of Australia in my reflections on Shinzo Abe himself. Our terms did not overlap all that much, but I do remember the extraordinary leadership which he reflected in the office of Prime Minister. The most vivid reflection I have of Shinzo Abe was, in fact, after I left office and I was asked to moderate a public session between Shinzo Abe, the then Prime Minister of Japan, and Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, in Vladivostok at the Far Eastern Economic Forum. And this was an extraordinary event because there I was in the middle of a conversation, myself having left office with these two heads of government, as Shinzo Abe decided to take on this public forum to use it as an opportunity to make a formal public pitch to President Putin to resolve once and for all the outstanding question of the disputed Northern Territories. That is, those territories to the north of Japan, those islands to the north of Japan, which the Soviet Union had seized from Japan at the conclusion of the Second World War. I well remember Shinzo Abe's strong, eloquent, passionate, from the pulpit, advocacy as to why Vladimir, as he referred to him in the public gathering, and he, Shinzo, could not do this deal, given that they were both leaders of their country and both determined to put to one side the problems of history. What I admired most about Shinzo Abe's performance that day was the sheer courage of it. He undertook that public advocacy and public request of Putin, not knowing what the answer would be. Putin's answer, as history records, was a very simple and cold "niet." No, he would not be doing such a deal on the Northern Territories and then return to Japanese sovereignty. But what I admired in the political leader that I saw in Shinzo Abe that day was someone who's prepared to take a risk in order to move the dial forward. And what I've observed with Shinzo Abe's performance as Prime Minister across those many years, 2006-07, and then, of course, in his second term, 2012-13 to 2020, was again his preparedness to use his political capital to deploy it in support of the major reforms to Japanese foreign policy, Japanese security policy, Japanese economic policy, and Japanese social policy in order to move the dial on Japan's place in the region and the world. A remarkable man, not without controversy, but a truly remarkable man. On these personal reflections, perhaps I could now turn to the former Foreign Minister of Japan, Yoriko Kawaguchi, to share with us her personal reflections, having worked with Prime Minister Abe in Japanese politics. Yoriko, some reflections from you.
Okay, thank you. I don't remember when I first met, but that was about 2000. And when I was Foreign Minister of Japan, he was Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary under Prime Minister Koizumi. And I was dealing with the abduction issue by North Korea of the Japanese nationals. And this was one of the issues that he was very concerned with. He met with the family members of the abductees and pushing the issue forward. He is a very warm person. I have never seen him raise his voice. He remembers people, and he has enough information to deal with each politician or non-politician Japanese citizens. There are just many people who I think he has had a very good team around him who really admired him, who respected him, and who was in a way dependent on him, regarded him as a good leader. I think he was naturally born to be a good political leader. He never, when you talk to him, He never really made a wall between you and him. He comes down to you and he listens to you as long as you want to talk. Although I'm sure he was bored or he was impatient inside himself. He never showed it. So that's why many people liked him. And when you talk of a good leader, you might think of a very strong person. Yes, he was a strong person. As Kevin was just describing, he did not hesitate to raise issues. But he led the country, the Japanese people, very warmly, in a very personally concerned manner to whatever issues that he had to deal with. I think he has two aspects. One is a reformist. He was willing to, and he wanted to bring in reform into the Japanese society. And he also was a nationalist in a way, but not narrow-minded nationalist, internationalist and idealist, believing in democracy, freedom, rule of law. When I saw his picture on this screen just moments ago, I became very emotional. We still cannot get over what happened 4 days ago. I think it will take time for us to get over whatever the implications that this incident brought us with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yoriko. Yours is a very human reflection, not just on Prime Minister Abe's warmth, as you mentioned, that extraordinarily sensitive question of dealing with those who've been abducted from Japan by the North Koreans and dealing with individual families, but also the warmth which has been reflected in response to the Japanese people and public to his family and those who are closest to him, given the extraordinary tragedy of his death. And for those of us who have been elected political office before, like yourself and myself, it is a shock when one of our colleagues, democratically elected, is destroyed by an assassin's bullet. It's an assault on all of us who are Democrats, all of us. Okay. So your reaction just now, as you've described it, to seeing the picture of this great man now laid low by an assassin's bullet is an entirely human one. Danny Russel, you're a Japan expert. You've served in Japan. You're a professional US diplomat. You've also worked in the Obama White House administration in senior positions. Your reflections on Shinzo Abe, the man.
Thanks, Kevin. Well, I worked with Prime Minister Abe and his team initially in his first term in 2006-07 when I was the Consul General in Osaka. But then, of course, beginning in December of 2012, when I was Obama's special assistant and Prime Minister Abe took over in Japan, and there were many, many meetings and many amazing adventures culminating in the joint trips of the two presidents, first to Hiroshima and then to Pearl Harbor. But perhaps my claim to fame would be that I actually knew and worked with Abe Shinzo in 1985 when he was the private secretary to his father, then Foreign Minister Abe Shintaro, and I was the staff assistant to then U.S. Ambassador Mike Mansfield. And as the two principal aides, we often spoke on the phone. We would meet for ramen and plan our bosses' next meetings. And my claim to fame is that I once invited Abe to an embassy party to which he brought his date, certain Miss Akie, who subsequently became his wife. So I like to think that I may have played a little role in facilitating that union.
Danny, if you knew the new Shinzo, the young Shinzo Abe, I should say, in a way perhaps none of the rest of us did, and did he have the gleam of political leadership and ambition in his eye well and truly then?
He had it in his DNA, Kevin. Abe Shinzo was truly to the manor born. He was part of Japan's political aristocracy. His father, who ironically died at the same age as Abe Shinzo has, died unexpectedly as well, albeit of natural causes, and so never fulfilled what seemed like his manifest destiny of becoming prime minister. Abe's grandfather was, of course, the famous prime minister of the post-war period. And there was never any doubt he virtually inherited his seat in Yamaguchi Prefecture. So the progression from the assistant or the private secretary to one's politician father to being a politician in his own right was almost automatic. What I certainly never imagined was the heights to which he would ascend, the success that he would have within the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, or the tremendous impact and influence that he would exert. That was definitely not visible at that time.
Wendy Cutler, trade negotiator, lots of dealings with Japan, reflections which you have on either the Prime Minister and his personal leadership style, or more general in his contribution to Japanese public policy. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks. And, when we talk about the Prime Minister Abe's legacy, I think we really need to include international trade as a key component of that. I mean, what he did on TPP, you talk about taking a bold action in a country where free trade was, not talked about, and the domestic opposition he had to take on, particularly from his agriculture community. And he was able to pull this off. To deal with his domestic politics, and yet, put together an incredible team, recognize he needed to bring his negotiating team into the Kante, into his office, because he knew the way that the Japanese had negotiated trade agreements to that date did not lead to favorable outcomes or comprehensive outcomes. So watching him and his team in action for me was an incredible honor. And just 8 weeks ago, when I was in Japan, I was honored to have a very small meeting with him. And I was always struck in all my dealings with him, but particularly 8 weeks ago, how substantive he was. And what he wanted to talk about was there any chance, were there any circumstances under which I thought that the US could return to CPTPP? And that's kind of the man that I kind of remember, a risk taker, a reformer, but just incredibly substantive.
I think that's our collective reflection. I should remind our viewers that Wendy was recently in Japan receiving from the government of Japan the Order of the Rising Sun. So for her extraordinary contribution to trade policy, but also the trade relationship between the United States and Japan. Thank you for those reflections, Wendy. Takako, you've been on the ground in Tokyo watching the public's reaction to this violent act in Japanese politics. Give us a sense of how you think the people are handling this not just political tragedy, but personal tragedy for the Abe family.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Yes, I think it's been quite striking how the people have come out to the streets. There was a proceeding, a motorcade from his funeral to the LDP headquarters, to the Diet office and the Prime Minister's office. And it's not surprising that people working for government or people who work for him at the party will come out, but there's just so many people lining the streets. And not just that, but there was memorials set up, not at the site of the shooting, but also in places like his alma mater and also in his hometown, but also places that have some kind of relationship with Abe, Prime Minister Abe, like the Toyako Summit site. There was a memorial set up and people are bringing flowers there. So I think it's just that, and another thing that's striking is there's a lot of younger people. And I realized that for the younger generation, he's basically the only leader that they remember quite well. And that's going to have a certain impact. And that's something that I've been really thinking about. and especially since it came right before the election, and it came in a form of such gun violence that we don't really see in Japan. I think this is going to be a really memorable moment for people here that they'll look back to and think about what they were doing on the day that Prime Minister Abe was killed.
Thank you. Let's go to the policy legacy, therefore, of Shinzo Abe. Mention has just been made before by Wendy of what he did in terms of trade policy. So let's start there. Yoriko, Wendy quite rightly pointed to the fact that this was an extraordinary act of politics. Those of us who know your wonderful country really well know that free trade has not always necessarily been the friend of Japanese domestic politics. And therefore, for Shinzo Abe to take this idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then to sell it, first of all, to the US administration, and then sell it to other countries in the region, but most importantly, sell it to his own system, both the LDP and the much feared and revered MITI within Japanese domestic political bureaucracy. How did he actually manage to pull this off? This is what I find quite remarkable as a 100% gaijin. I find this quite remarkable how he did it.
I would like to say two things. One is that he has had, when he was prime minister, a very strong political capital to implement what he wanted to implement. As you said, and my second point is that traditionally, Japan is an internationalist country. We do not have resources other than human resources. So we needed to purchase materials and intermediate products and to sell. And I remember the time when we had just so small foreign exchanges. People thought that unless we could trade, Japan would not really survive. But as you mentioned, that there is a strong group, agriculture group, and some, maybe a couple of others who are not for free trade. But overall, business circle included, we are for the international trade, free trade. So the key was to balance and also to that we come to a solution that every sector is happy about. And he had that is where his political leadership was needed and worked. Because people, after all, thought that if that is the case, if he wants it this way, we would follow. I think it's the atmosphere he created. Thank you.
Danny, you're a serious Japan expert. You know the country really well. It must have been an enormous kick in the stomach when Trump decided to walk away from the TPP. How do you think Shinzo Abe coped with that, given he'd expended so much domestic political capital, as Yoriko has just said, in advancing this as a international trade policy initiative of the government of Japan, only to see Japan's closest ally slam the door shut? How did he cope with it, and then what did he do in response to it? I'm quite intrigued by this. Danny?
Well, Wendy is the world's expert on TPP and CPTPP, so I'll just speak to the political and the strategic aspect of this, which is that for Shinzo Abe as well as for Barack Obama, TPP was every bit as much a strategic initiative as it was a trade initiative. And I think that the shiver of fear that Shinzo Abe felt when on his first day the president new president, President Trump, reneged on that agreement, was less about trade, perhaps, and much more about what the world would look like with America disengaging, America abandoning its critically important defense of collaborative regional and global system. I think it's borne out by the really impressive activism of Abe, not limited to the trade and the economic sphere, but obviously including that, to not only establish and bolster Japan's stature and role on the international stage, but more importantly, to try to hold together a rules-based order. And I think he's understood TPP as a manifestation of the principle that we needed to modernize the rules that we lived by. We needed to abide by the rules that we adopted, and we needed to set high standards that would, rather than ostracize and isolate a country like China, would give it something to aspire to, along with some incentives to get there. But again, Wendy can speak volumes to the transition to CPTPP and what was involved in that.
So Wendy, I should tell again our viewing audience and listening audience that you're America's lead negotiator on the TPP. So I'm sure you had some feelings too when it went up in smoke when President Trump took out his very large felt pen. It seemed that he can only ever write in letters that big, but even I could read Donald Trump across the rescindment order. So, but reflecting on Shinzo Abe, he, as an external observer, he didn't just take it lying down. He thought, how do I rebirth this? So your reflections on the death of TPP and the birth of CPTPP.
So definitely a feeling of shock and I'd say despair. And right after Trump exited the US or withdrew the US from TPP, Shinzo Abe said something along the lines of TPP is going to be meaningless without the United States. And so I think a number of us just thought this was just going to die. But he didn't give up. And I think as he thought this through more, I think he really thought he could convince Donald Trump to return to TPP. And I think Danny can attest to all the times that this was raised by Abe with the American presidents about getting back into TPP. And I think he also recognized that in talking to the other CPTPP countries, that he could work with them to, bring a new version into effect. What was so impressive about that turnaround is that Japan really showed leadership, particularly in an area where, frankly, in their posture in most trade negotiations up until that time had been very defensive, not offensive. So he took a leadership role, and he was able also to make sure and keep most of the agreement intact, recognizing that if Japan started pulling things off the table, others would, and the agreement would unravel, and that wasn't in his interest. So I think it was remarkable that as he led the renegotiation of TPP and brought CPTPP into place, that he did not bow to agriculture pressure to take some of the agriculture concessions off the table. He left them in the agreement, but offered them to the other 10 countries, not to the United States. Now, ultimately, Trump got him back to the negotiating table, and with the threat of auto tariffs, I think Abe had no choice but to provide agriculture market access to the United States. But again, watching this saga and how Abe did turn this around, particularly from his initial comments about, I would call someone being in despair about TPP, it's quite an achievement, and I would say an important part of his legacy as we reflect on it in this event.
Well, thank you for that, Takako. We're about halfway through our time together in this wider reflection on Shinzo Abe's life and career and legacy, but to change our focus now to foreign security policy. Let me pose this question to you. I wrote just literally yesterday in The Economist magazine that China and the rise of China was very much the organizing principle for much of Shinzo Abe's international policy. As Danny said before, the TPP was strategic policy as much as it was economic policy. But then, of course, we have the major changes he brought about to the machinery of bureaucratic machinery of Japanese national security policy. You had, of course, the legislation which changed the interpretation of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. His commitment in terms of greater expenditure on military hardware, and his other legislative initiatives which opened for the first time the possibility, albeit under restricted circumstances, for collective security action. So as an ill-informed gaijin looking at all this stuff, he strikes me as remarkably transformative of Japanese foreign and security policy against most of the post-war measures. But I'd really, because this is your area of expertise, Takako, I'd really value your reflections on that.
Thank you, Kevin. I think what you said about the machinery part is the less understood, that I think he not only transformed policy, but also the process in which decisions are made. And I think there has been quite a few interviews that he's given over the past year. And what strikes me is that he really didn't take the US-Japan alliance for granted. And that was because of what he thought about China, as you say, but at the same time, it wasn't just about the US-Japan alliance, but he actually played the strategic game in a way of, as you mentioned, we're trying to reach out to Vladimir Putin. And also with China, it's really right before COVID, there was talk of possibly a visit, or there was something that he was trying to do that might be not what people usually think of him. Also, the other thing is the Quad and, of course, the free and open Indo-Pacific. But I was really struck by the recollection and the message from India after his passing. And I think this all shows that his vision, although people would tend to focus on the US-Japan alliance part or the Trump part, that he was trying to do was a lot greater. And that part tends to be overlooked when we look at his legacy of what he tried to do on a foreign policy scene. And also, as you mentioned, in terms of machinery, it was not just the policy, but the process. And that part, since I think we're at this point looking back and thinking, is it really that he transformed the process completely, or was it really driven by his personal drive? And that's something that we have to see in Japan as things unfold going forward, because he did leave us with a lot of things that he wanted to do. And I'm sure that he would have wanted to see it through, but he unfortunately could not. So we have to see what happens with what he tried to do.
If you were to give our viewing audience a simple 60 seconds on the before and after of his reforms to the process of Japanese national security policy decision-making, I think that'd be useful for our audience.
Yes. So Japan always had something called the National Security Council, but it didn't really have a substantial secretariat that came with. And he, being a prime minister, although this happened alongside other reforms that centralized power within the prime minister's office, still, especially on the security side, which came later than other issues, the fact that there is a pretty robust national security secretariat that has people coming all from the foreign ministry, defense ministry, and including self-defense force officer, the uniform personnel is very different, that the prime minister has his own brains trust with him in engaging security policy, and they meet a lot more regularly than before. And these are the mechanics that he set in place as prime minister. And I think that had worked well, both in terms of Japan's crisis management, and we will be seeing what the results of that will be in terms of Japan's defense planning, because we are having major decisions happening this year with the redrafting of the national security strategy and the national defense strategy and the defense planning. So we'll see how the process works out this time too. But I think that's something that we think is more institutionalized than that will be one of his legacies, to bringing in these kind of mechanics to Japan's security system.
Yoriko, you're a former foreign minister of Japan. How central was the rise of China as an organizing principle to Shinzo Abe's foreign security policy?
Well, the answer is, of course, that is a major issue that promoted the change in the Japanese foreign policy. But the line of thinking has been, it's not that he changed the course of our foreign policy. Japan's foreign policy has been, in my mind, always built around the idea of how we could deter foreign risks coming to Japanese peace and stability from foreign countries. Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and now DPRK, and also China. So we place importance to alliance with the United States. And the US is the only one country we call an ally. That is very important for various reasons, but one of the major reasons is security. Hub and spoke relationship that Asian countries has had with the United States. But so the risk has changed, and China is one of the major ones. But but I think in my mind, Prime Minister Abe was pursuing the same policy, international policy, which former foreign prime ministers were pursuing. It's just that they could not get things accomplished. Prime Minister Abe has had enough political capital to get things done. That's the major difference. It's not that there's a quality. I mean, the difference is in quality. It's just that ability to implement. And he, in that sense, he elevated Japanese foreign policy to meet the existing risks that we perceive as risks.
Thank you so much. Danny, you're a seasoned observer of the evolution of Japanese foreign security policy. Again, your reflections on the China factor, obviously. Secondly, how deeply transformative has the Abe period been in terms of the direction and substance of Japanese foreign security policy? And finally, something which I think Takako touched on before, which is the important point that he was not simply a monochrome foreign policy actor. He constantly had his vision cast wider in two senses. The Quad, obviously the India relationship, to a lesser extent the Australia relationship. But secondly, frankly, a more nuanced approach to trying to manage tensions down, at least with Putin's Russia, but also in those efforts during the period of 2019-2020 of securing a return bilateral from Xi Jinping to Tokyo after his own bilateral, which effectively unfroze the relationship from that period going back to the nationalization of Senkaku back in, from memory, 2012. So your reflections on those points, Danny?
Thanks, Kevin. I think without a doubt, the rise of China was a huge influencer in Abe's thinking and his policies. Was certainly one of, if not the organizing principle. I think another organizing principle, however, was a deep conviction that the US-led post-war, what he called the rules-based order, this concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, was not a theoretical objective, that this was the world that he wanted to live in and he wanted to help to defend. Abe frequently said, I remember him talking about Japan's neighborhood and the geography. And I think that because of the long history Japan had with difficult neighbors, China, Russia, Korea, but also because of the very clear and present dangers that he saw coming from the unresolved legacy of the war with those neighbors. Abe was really determined to involve and sustain American engagement in the region. And that, ironically, one of the drivers behind his incredible activism as prime minister, remember, he made an astonishing 80 some odd trips abroad as prime minister. He engaged very actively in a whole host of multilateral activities, and as you mentioned, really helped to invent some, like the Quad. This had to do, I'm sorry to say, with a certain skepticism on his part as to whether America was really up to the task, as to whether America was really going to be there in the decisive way that it had been in the past, and was able to contend effectively with these challenges from China in the first instance, North Korea and Russia as well, to maintain this kind of rules-based order. So I think the transformation, as both Kawaguchi Sensei and Takako have said, was not in the direction of Japanese policy, but in the incredible effectiveness with which he wielded the mechanics of government, the effective way in which he presented a real image and vision. He put a face on Japan for the world after a blur of relatively faceless prime ministers. And he stood for something nationally, regionally, and globally. And I think that that represents a transformative element in Japan's history.
I know Wendy has to leave us soon, so I'm just going to leave one question with her before she goes, and we'll can sustain this in your absence, Wendy, which is his efforts to reform the Japanese economy domestically, and also Abenomics. It generated its own noun, and then we had associated with that womenomics on Japanese social policy. Both of these questions are of interest to you and your work with us at the Asia Society. Quick reflections on how far he got on both those questions. And then I'll flip the same questions to Yoriko once you've gone. Wendy.
I think, in both of those areas, I think he had the right objectives, but I would kind of give him an incomplete, unfortunately. I think Abenomics had, the three arrows on monetary policy, a bit more successful, fiscal policy, less successful, and structural reform. Frankly, I would argue that most of the structural reform came from agriculture reform, which was part of his trade policy. With respect to women, womenomics, look, he put the issue on the table. He promoted women. He was responsible for getting legislation through on childcare and other, mechanisms to make it easier for women in the workplace. But Japan still faces huge challenges in that space, particularly with respect to senior level Japanese women showing up in the boardroom and, in the government, in the cabinet, et cetera. But again, people are talking about womenomics and, improvements were made, just a lot further to go. And so hopefully, that legacy will continue. It'll be something that Prime Minister Kishida will also put an emphasis on. Particularly given the demographic crisis in Japan, you need more women in the workplace. They can help.
Absolutely, Wendy. And thank you for being with us for this discussion. Yoriko, taking up the themes which Wendy's just raised. on the
Yes.
economy and the role of women in the Japanese economy and frankly in society as well, because they're both linked. And I'll come to Takako after you. Your reflections on that. You're both successful Japanese women in a society which Australian men like me would even say is a pretty solidly male-dominated society, which is bad. So your reflections on that, Yoriko?
Yes. Well, I agree with what Wendy just said about his accomplishment in these areas. He had good intentions, good policies, but there he was not able to accomplish as much as he did in foreign policy areas. The major reform of the Japanese economy, the third arrow of Abenomics, is in the process. It's an accomplished job for Prime Minister Abe. Women, he was really interested and enthusiastic. I remember the one conference that he initiated, which is called WOW, W-O-W, in which Japan invited many leadership women from all the countries outside Japan, including African leaders, female African leaders. And there are many sessions. And Prime Minister, I was attending one of the sessions. Prime Minister Abe himself came to the meeting, spending whole afternoon attending, listening, and asking questions, discussing. This is an extraordinary act for our busy Prime Minister. He was very eager. He wanted to push, he wanted to increase female participation in the senior level, working level. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Takako. I think what both Yoriko and Wendy are saying, he's placed on the agenda, but a huge distance still to travel. Give me a sense of how far you think he pushed the dial, right, and what must now happen under Kishida-san in order to take this to a whole new reality. Over to you.
Right. Just to pick up on the women's side of things, I think it was interesting that Mr. Abe had the political capital, and I think he knew his place in the sense that he represented, or he had strong support on the conservative wing of his party. So he knew that he was sort of the unlikely, but maybe effective, that he will face less criticism from the right when he promotes these type of policies, whether it's women or maybe even foreign workers. So I think that he was effective in being the sort of unlikely advocate. And of course, he had his critiques because he was somewhat the unlikely advocate. And I think it's a long way to go. I agree with Wendy that it's still an incomplete, but I'm hoping that there is some good news coming out of the fact that we had the record number of women elected to the upper house election this time. And although the number is still small, I think we're on the right track, and hopefully it will accelerate a little bit quicker so that things will change just a lot faster. So, thank you.
And in the Japanese boardrooms, Takako, which matters as well because it affects women being appointed to executive positions and what a phenomenon getting women into the workforce. What are your views there?
Unfortunately, I've been always in academia, so that's an area I'm not that familiar with, but I do see new friends becoming board members, and I think that's a new trend that I'm hoping that will accelerate so that my good female friends will be represented more in the corporate area as well.
We've got about 10 minutes to go, and I was going to wrap up with a couple of themes which each of you have touched on so far, but I think it's worthwhile exploring further. One is, Yoriko mentioned this before, that Shinzo Abe was a nationalist. And of course, this created controversy in countries around Japan, most particularly in the Republic of Korea. If you would try to give me a sense, each of you, of trying to define Shinzo Abe's notion of patriotism and nationalism, how would you describe it to an international audience in a way which would make sense? perhaps I start with you, Danny, because you've been silent for a bit. I'm going to flick back to both Yoriko and Takako as well. I think you're on mute, my friend. And if you're still on mute, I will turn to Yoriko to answer the question first.
Okay. I think what was on his mind, Shinzo's mind, was peace and stability and prosperity of Japan. He was politically, he was a conservative, but not narrow-minded, as I said, nationalist. He was an idealist and at the same time a realist. I remember he visited Yasukuni Shrine. And then after many things going on between Japan and China, he stopped visiting Yasukuni. I think he went twice, but did not later on. That shows his realistic side of his political behavior. He was thinking of the situation in a very strategic way, whether what his policy will serve the purpose he wanted to achieve, which is peace. And that really explains his behavior in my mind. Thank you.
Danny, your reflections on that before I go to Takako.
Right. Apologies for my technical issue a moment ago. I couldn't agree more with Kawaguchi Sensei. The essence of Shinzo Abe, in my view, is a mix of ideological nationalists on the one hand and consummate pragmatist on the other. He balanced his approach to China, for example, with a, say, carrot and a stick. He did actively court Xi Jinping, as you, Kevin, alluded to, as well as making what most people consider to be an ill-fated effort to persuade Vladimir Putin to negotiate the status of the northern territories. He traveled to North Korea. He attempted both reasoning and sanctions in an effort to deal with both the nuclear problem and the issue of the abductees. And he, whether you like it or not, he navigated the very abrupt transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, always mindful of where Japan's national interests lie. And he went to great lengths, even some would argue embarrassing himself, in an effort to try to sustain strong ties and with the United States and strong US engagement with Japan and in the region. So his motto when he ran in 2012 was "Beautiful Japan." And I think that reflected not just a political slogan for domestic consumption, but a form of loyalty to the nation and the culture, very mindful of its long history, that spurred his efforts to ensure that Japan would act as and be seen as a world leader and a major contributor.
A word from you, Takako, on this one, and I've got one final question to ask about what Danny has just touched upon, which is Shinzo Abe's leadership on, let's call it, the liberal democratic world at a time when there were questions about whether America wished to remain as leader. But just before we do that, a minute or two from you on understanding for an international audience Shinzo Abe's nationalism, Yasukuni and the rest.
Yes, I think what he was for Japan is best described in the headline of an article in The Economist, which called him the champion of Japan. And I think people might have disagreed with what kind of vision he might have had as what kind of champion Japan might be, but people had no doubts that he was a strong, determined, and devoted leader. And as you say, I think people are appreciative of the fact that they're seeing now that he seemed to have been a respected leader around the world. And so that's how I like describe his nationalism in a different way.
Just to conclude, Danny raised a fascinating point before, and it's something, again, I've reflected on indirectly in what I've written in The Economist myself, which is when there are grave doubts on the part of many of us who are allies of the United States as to where the Trump administration was actually going and whether it was fundamentally changing the face of American, not just domestic politics, but America's post-war obligations to its treaty allies and its whole notion of international and global leadership. And we all, as intelligent observers of these events, saw one case after another of Trump cuddling up to North Korean dictators and then giving his traditional allies in Japan and the Republic of Korea and in Europe a hard time and threatening to withdraw troops and God knows whatever else. So what fascinated me about Japan in this period under Shinzo Abe, Danny, was his, it's almost an internal resolve to try and keep the band together while the Americans are out to lunch under periods of the Trump administration. I saw this, for example, in the way in which he managed his diplomacy with both Delhi and Canberra. I saw it in terms of his diplomacy in Europe, his diplomacy even with partners at the UN. And of course, the Germans and others and the Indians sort of, I think, got the script, but he would have been, frankly, preeminent in, use my term advisedly, holding the foreign policy and security band of the liberal democratic world together while America sorted itself out. Your reflections on that one, Danny, as we draw this discussion to a close.
I think you put your finger on it, and it tracks neatly with the points that Kawaguchi Sensei and Wendy made about TPP and the transition to CPTPP. You touched on something very important, Kevin, which is that Abe was not exclusively focused on the Asia Pacific, although he invested very heavily in building a strong relationship with Australia, as you mentioned, New Zealand, with India, and very importantly, and he really did a tremendous amount to sort of draw India into the fold, but with the Pacific Islands as well, and importantly with ASEAN. He was tremendously active at a time when the US was missing in action. But it didn't stop in the Indo-Pacific, because his engagement with the UK, his engagement with the EU, his engagement with Africa in the TCAD, his engagement through the G7, through the G20, and in various UN formats really propelled Japan into a position of constructive influence in support of these principles of mutual respect, of collaboration, of making common cause. And as you noted, and I referred to earlier, he did a magnificent job of creating what's really a kind of league of like-minded middle powers that have done a great deal to not only hold the United States in the global network as an active member, but also to hold that network together independently of the United States.
Thank you so much. Yoriko, any reflections on what I've just said, and Danny's?
Yes, I want to say that Japan-US relationship alliance is the most important pillar of our foreign policy. And that alliance needs to be cultivated always. So that was what Shinzo Abe was doing. And that also means that we should be helping, going along with the US to have the kind of world that we want to have, that is rule of law, freedom, democracy, and all that. So that's what he was doing.
So Takako, the last word goes to you, my friend. Abe, the bridge builder and the band holder together of, and there's a forward reference here. Trump comes back, an isolationist America returns in the future under a non-Trump but Trump-like presidency. This critical role of holding the liberal democratic world together. Your reflections on that as we close our discussion today.
Yes, I think the sense of that is very strong now, right now, especially given Ukraine. And that Japan feels that there is something to be said about Japan being in the liberal democratic part, but without trying to waive the democracy part too much. Prime Minister Kishida has been active in dealing with countries, not just with NATO, but also countries that will align with Japan if we talk about unilateral change of the status quo by force is bad. So I think Japan's going to try to work with NATO, work with other liberal democratic allies, but also be mindful of the fact that Asian countries might have different interests in this and trying to hold the band together, but not just exclusively with other so-called Western countries and try to play a role in a different way possibly. And I think that's something that's very important going forward for Japan.
Yes, I look forward for the day when our friends in Europe and our friends in the United States stop simply using the term the West as if it's co-definitional with the liberal democratic world.
Right.
It is a much wider and more inclusive concept, which a 15-second reflection on the composition of the Quad should cause people to reach a different conclusion.
Right.
Yoriko Kawaguchi, thank you for your service as Foreign Minister of Japan and as a dear friend of the Asia Society, and for joining us in this important conversation today about your former colleague and Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe. Danny Russel, thank you for your reflections, wise as ever and knowledgeable of Japan as ever. And Takako, given your particular focus in Tokyo on the national security machinery of the Japanese government, thank you for your observations as well, and Wendy in her absence. I'll just conclude by saying this. Politicians come and go, and I've been one that's come and gone. But there is an interesting reflection on Abe-san, which is the world was not just shocked by the act of violence. The world was deeply shocked that this was an act of violence against a man who had moved the dial on so many different fronts, so that the face of Japanese politics, but Japan's profile in the world had changed because of his period in office. And I think all of us would say had changed for the better. And so with those concluding remarks, on behalf of us all and on behalf of the Asia Society's global family, we honour Shinzo Abe's life and career. And if I could say on behalf of us all, the world, and not just Japan, is poorer for his passing. My name's Kevin Rudd. Thank you for joining us in this important webinar from the Asia Society as we join you from our network around the world, reflecting on the life and times and passing of this extraordinary man, Shinzo Abe. Thank you all.